happens is that there were members of the scroll community who were a violently nationalistic community. We have to understand the scroll community hated the Romans, wanted to get rid of them, hated the Herodian kings and wanted to get rid of them. And it's rather interesting that the temple was built by the Herodian kings. And so that gives another twist on the whole, the Wailing Wall phenomenon. I mean, we've got now, particularly the Orthodox Jews in Jerusalem spend a lot of time at the Western Wall. That was built by Herod, who wasn't actually Jewish and who perpetrated a lot of crimes on the Jewish people. So, there's a few problems there.
How did you find that out, Michael?
Well, it's standard history. We know that Herod built the temple, Herod's temple. We know that no one would dispute it. What people like to forget is how awful Herod was. Herod methodically murdered all the surviving members of the line of David that he could get his hands on. He drowned the male heir in the pool of his villa in Jericho. He had others murdered. He was a terrible person, and yet it's his temple that's everyone worships at. I just think there's a bit of a problem there.
Wow.
But no one's talking about it.
You are.
I am.
So how do the Jewish people and the Israelis respond to your declaration of that in the historic record?
Well, the Israelis have given me a bit of a hard time one way or the other. Not too bad, but...
What did they say?
Well, no, they've just done sort of funny things. Like on one occasion, they loaded an entire 747 with passengers ready to take off, except for me. And they left me in this little departure hall with all my luggage for about, 20 minutes or so, and everyone studiously ignored me. Eventually they loaded me on and we took off. But it's just these I get picked up in the street a lot and questioned and this kind of stuff, just sort of low-key hassles. The problem is that I've written about the relationship between the fundamentalist Christians in the United States and the right-wing Israeli politicians. You see, the right-wing Israeli politicians are quite happy to accept all this money and support from the fundamentalist Christians who believe that there's certain signs before Jesus comes back, and that is, the formation of the State of Israel, which has happened, the taking of Jerusalem, which has happened, and the third thing is the rebuilding of the temple, which hasn't yet happened, but they're keen that it should occur. But of course, if you ask any fundamentalist Christian what will happen then, Jesus will come back and will convert all the Jews to Christianity. Now, the Jewish authorities, of course, when you ask them that, they don't really want to talk about it.
Do you mean the Jewish authorities or the Israeli authorities? And they're not necessarily the same.
They're not necessarily the same, but both of them have pretty much the same attitude.
Okay.
They're quite happy to accept the money and the political support, but they don't really want to explore the implications of the belief systems, which, as I've said, is that Jesus is going to come back and convert the Jews to Christianity. So there's a problem there too, which no one likes to talk about too much, but which I talk about. In fact, my last book, Racing Towards Armageddon, I talk about it quite extensively because that's what that book is concerned about, these kind of problems.
What do you think about Mordecai Gihon?
Well, I don't know. You mean the expert on Bar Kochba? Or
yes, the expert on Bar Kochba.
Yeah, he's a really, really good man. I was going to do a book with him, in fact. I never did. I would still like to. I think Bar Kochba is one of the most fascinating characters in Jewish history.
Can you talk about him?
Yeah, I mean, Bar Kochba emerged around very early 2nd century. And he obviously had spent some time or had served in the Roman army because he knew Roman army tactics. And he had these huge caves in the Jordan Valley where he used to train his guys secretly in, Roman style of warfare. And at the same time, Jewish captives were working as slaves for the Roman army, and they were producing the weapons. And Suetonius tells us that the Jewish captives used to make slightly substandard weaponry, and so the Romans would reject them. And this substandard weaponry would not be melted down and remade, but it would be stolen and given to Bar Kokhba's forces. And eventually Bar Kokhba emerged, and he actually fought and defeated the Roman legions in Judea. And for probably 3 or 4 years, there were no Roman legions there at all, and Bar Kokhba ruled. But where he came unstuck was that he relied on the Parthians, who were about the only country that Rome was absolutely terrified of, because the Parthians were these amazing horsemen who fired arrows, and they just would sweep into the armies, fire their arrows, and sweep away again. And the Romans could never really get their measure. And the idea was the Parthians were going to invade from the north east, and Bar Kokhba was going to manage to kind of solidify his position. But of course he was on a hiding to nothing, because whatever Bar Kokhba did, there's always going to be too many Roman legions, and that's eventually what happened. The Romans threw, I think, 6 or 7 legions in, and they just wiped Judea out. But the cost in blood was so tremendous, both on the Roman side and the Jewish side, that by the late 2nd century, both sides were pretty much at peace. They just weren't annoying each other again, because the cost had been too high, and they realized that it was ridiculous. But it produced really the beginnings. I mean, rabbinical Judaism had started a little earlier, but it dominated after the demise of Bar Kokhba. I mean, that's where the current style of Judaism really took off and reached well into the diaspora. So Bar Kokhba is a fascinating figure and one of the great heroes of Jewish history. And Mordecai Gichon is probably the greatest expert on Bar Kokhba, who had, as I say, a lot of underground sites where he used to hide his men, who could sort of emerge, fight, and then just melt back into the hills. And no one knew where they were.
You have a very interesting life, don't you?
Well, I get bored easy.
I think you've picked the most exciting and yet challenging and scary thing to follow, really. I called Michael Cremo the Columbo of archaeology, but I'm going to come up with a name for you.
Well, so long as it's a nice one, I can live with just about anything.
Talk a little bit about why you think the Vatican has obtained and destroyed writings for so long, and that basically all things lead to Rome, and what can be done about it.
Well, I say in my book that all the rivers of blood lead to Rome, and I think that's pretty much it. I mean, Rome is all about power and centralization, and that's all that you need to know. As we now say, ironically, Rome is the sort of moral arbiter. I mean, all the scandals that it's had recently show just how thin that moral status of Rome is. But it's Rome, right from the start, has been about power. Because remember, initially it was the Roman Empire, and when the Roman Empire disintegrated, really we had the popes. You see, the first pope who became a strong man was really in the early 5th century, and that's about the time when the Visigoths first invaded and looted Rome. So the political and military entity of Rome was disintegrating, but the theological entity of Rome was becoming powerful. And that's basically what happened. The popes took over the role, in a sense, of the emperors.
Do you think that in your lifetime, Rome will be destroyed?
Oh, I hope not. Rome is one of the most beautiful cities in the world. I mean, it is the lair of the beast, admittedly, but I couldn't care less what happens to St. Peter's so long as they save the artworks. I'd like to see the end of the papacy. I'd like to see the Pope just Bishop of Rome again, the way he always was, and have a sort of decentralized Catholic